time, we've had absolutely world-class speakers as we've looked at religious support and all things gender. Keep your cards and letters coming in, please. And what we're going to do now, I've got a number of questions here. Please hold it down. And thank you very much. And what I want to do to start our panel discussion is ask our guest speakers just to direct a question so we get a little synergy. So just to ask another fellow panel member a question, just one, and we'll kick that off. So on my right, we're going to start with Dr. Don Snyder. So please ask a question for one of your fellow panelists. Because you're first.
Daniel, how can I improve my sense of humor in my presentation?
The student doesn't try and teach the master.
Very nice. Okay. We generally try to have, well, that was a good answer to a great question, so okay, well done. Dr. Grobine.
Daniel, I was also interested in asking you, you spoke of Jewish wisdom as providing just kind of this direction for life, really heading us in the right direction, help us to understand what's good, solid for human relationships, foundational for human relationships, and so forth. We've also had some speakers talk about the natural law. Would you or would you not make comparisons between Jewish wisdom and the natural law, and how would you compare, how would you contrast them or distinguish them?
It's a Venn diagram. There's considerable overlap, I think, between what constitutes ancient Jewish wisdom and natural law. Considerable overlap. There are areas of non-overlap where ancient Jewish wisdom is very skeptical about people's logical abilities and very persuaded of people's elastic consciences and human ability to distort perceptions of reality to fit preconceived ideas. In the areas, many of the areas and examples that Dr. Smith alluded to, Susan and I smiled and nodded at each other because it fitted so closely to the procedures and matrices of ancient Jewish wisdom. So I'd say that the overlaps are significant, and the differences fade away to obscurity in confrontation of the common problem, which is radical secularism taking over a culture.
Thank you. Rabbi, you're on the hot seat.
Oh, gosh, mine is easy. It's what Susan, I'm asking on her behalf as well, because we were both during lunch wondering about this, and Susan just yell out if I get this wrong, but we want to, as you usually do. Hold nothing back, as you never do. Our question to you, Dr. Smith, is you spoke about the need for education, and decent people understand this and recognize this, but what about a situation in which the institutions of education resemble government indoctrination camps more than they do educational institutions? Now what?
Now what? Yeah, it's sad. That's where we are. And I mean, people have to, as many people as can have to do homeschooling. As many people as can need to send them to religious schools. And if you can't do that, you have to have a counter indoctrination effort at home, which you probably have to have anyway. So you have to monitor very carefully what your children are learning. You have to read the books that they read, and talk with them about the books that they read, and ask them to see, talk what they're doing in class. What do you do in class today? What did you learn? What are you reading? What is the teacher saying? You don't want to be contradicting the teacher all the time. So that's hard work to figure out how to teach your child not to be disrespectful or disdainful of the teacher if they're always contradicting the teacher. But I mean, maybe people have greater wisdom than I have, but I'm sure you do. But to try to figure out, I mean, young people do like that. There's an odd way that young people like to believe they're told lies, right? They like that because it makes them feel smart. So even when you watch TV with kids and you look at a commercial and you just ask them a question, why did they have a scantily clad woman draped across the hood of that car and to sell the car? And the kids go, and then they figure it out and they feel very smart because they've got a critical faculty now to deal with things. So to try it at home, I think, teach them, we're not asking you to go in and embarrass your teacher or question her on everything, but we want you to be able to think for yourself, and then try to teach them how to think for themselves by what kind of questions you would ask about what they were being told and how there might be another side to the story. So, but I say homeschool first, religious school second, third, public education, try to find the best you can, but if you've got a very bad place, do counter education at home.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, your question.
Yeah, I guess I asked Dr. Grobian, I wasn't here for your section on natural law, and but you have a degree in moral theology. So I'd just like to say, what do you think is the both in the, I would ask you two-sided question. Both, the one might be easier to answer than the other. But in the world, what are you seeing is the biggest obstacle for being able to teach people right thinking about moral issues? And then secondly, in the profession, what is going on now that might be either helpful towards going in the right direction or an obstacle to going in the right direction?
So by profession, do you mean
academia?
Academy or?
Mm-hmm.
So I touched on this a little bit in the paper, and I'm happy to talk about it again because I think it's a really important point. What today is the biggest obstacle to understanding things in the natural law? And what I did is I actually did a little bit of a historical development of how the understanding of the natural law changed in the late medieval and then especially early modern and modern eras, and how with Thomas you have a strong realistic understanding of reason. A person's mind in some way participates in the mind of God through the light of reason. And with the developments that occurred then in the early modern era, this confidence in reason, especially with the rise of voluntarism, the will becomes more important. A monarch, law becomes more of a kind of a political, pragmatic tool for managing a group of people rather than sort of appealing to right reason. Even making claims about science that begin to use the term law for scientific claims and principles to say, well, this is a law of science, right? To have gravity. So we see that everything falls at a certain rate, or we see the planets revolving around the sun in a certain way. So we can call these laws. So that even the understanding of the word law shifts, and it becomes more something that's talked about either instinctive or more of an inclination, or with human beings more of kind of almost a psychologism, right? So it's whereas as Alistair McIntyre talks about an emotivism being. So now people misunderstand the natural law, I think in many cases at least, as, well, if it's natural, then nature means what I kind of instinctively feel like doing, or what my mind is sort of just pushing me towards apart from rational thinking. And so that's what I need to pursue. Then you combine that with utilitarian developments in the 18th and 19th century that are pursuing where things are about a pursuit of pleasure. And even though the early utilitarians defined pleasure broadly and tried to encourage people to think rationally about what is really pleasurable, at the end of the day, we're left with an emotivism, and we're left with kind of a pursuit of pleasure. And so even when we appeal to the natural law, often that's what people think of, and that's how people act. So I mean, I think your discussion of kind of common sense natural law, and especially what's really great with what you did is that you said, yeah, it's to turn this around, we need some of this one-on-one conversation, right? It's going to be, you have to see what is a person dealing with in their situation, and you just begin to ask them questions, right? And through the questioning, then they begin to see, oh, right, maybe what's reasonable isn't just what I'm sort of inclined to do. Maybe I should actually think about these things a little bit. So that's maybe the first part of your question. The second part, I mean, there are, I think, more and more, at least within Christian traditions, which is kind of where I focus my study, there's more and more scholars are kind of reaching out to natural law again, because I think they're seeing that there's a need in some way to appeal to these kinds of things. So you have, of course, the Reformed scholars, Stephen Pope, even our church body, the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod, published a collection of essays on the natural law about 7 or 8 years ago. So there's this rise of this interest. And I think scholars are beginning to re-uncover some of these basic truths that you've talked about, that Jay Budziszewski is talking about, and then also are articulating them in a conversation with the classical tradition, say, of Thomas. They're seeing how did figures like Luther or Calvin deal with the natural law, and they're seeing that in many cases they were very similar to how Thomas dealt with it, even while there were differences, and so they can bring that into the conversation. And I think the biggest challenge that today the Academy is seeing is this loss of a teleological sense of existence, right? So Thomas, of course, is working towards we have a purpose, and we're trying to reach that purpose. Today, the idea of there being some kind of divine or even sort of cosmic purpose is really foreign to sort of the postmodern worldview. So that's, I think, the academic challenge that more and more scholars are trying to deal with.
Thank you, Dr. Gomine. Dr. Snyder, your comment on this question.
Yeah, I'm going to turn Dr. Smith's question to the military profession, not the academic profession. And I took this part of my presentation out because it wasn't time. But what I want to posit to you is that your ethic is changing. The professional military ethic, understood as an institutional ethic, not the personal ethic of the soldier, I'll come to that in a minute, but the institutional ethic, how the Army determines what is good, right, and just as it creates institutional policies, etc. It's changing. And when I lecture on this subject to senior officers, there's always a hesitation because, first off, people are uncomfortable with their ethics changing. And then I make them even more uncomfortable by saying, you're responsible for changing it. That's what stewards of a profession do. You are the ones who have to lead up and say that we can only have an ethic of certain nature and certain things in it, or we're going to be an ineffective military. So in your mind, since I don't have a chart, there's a big circle, that's the Army's ethic. 3 arrows pointing to it. The strongest 3 influences on any military profession's ethic. The bottom one is treaties, codified law, international law. Set that aside. The lawyers take care of that. That's not so much your business. It's the other 2 that are essentially your business as strategic level leaders in the profession. The first one comes from the social imperative. The society expects you to adapt over time to reflect their political legitimacy and therefore for them to trust you. In my generation, the big issue was don't ask, don't tell. Now stop and think of this. During the whole period of don't ask, don't tell, no chief of staff or chief of naval operations conducted an internal study on what the influence of changing policy would be on the military. They simply asserted, well, this is against good order and discipline. Well, how did that work out for you? I mean, 8 years later, the argument was over, and society said, change. Now, I'm not sure that what the outcome would have been totally different, but what I'm pointing out is, I think they abrogated their responsibility to educate themselves and the public with some solid analysis, some empirics, and not relying just upon, well, my professional judgment tells me. That's not going to fly in the society anymore. So on the social side, and now you're dealing with even more sensitive issues in the spectrum of dysphoria, sexual dysphoria, and transgenderism. So this is complex, this is difficult, this is threatening, I understand all that, but you own the ethic. You know, the American people haven't the foggiest notion, and frankly, neither do their representatives in Congress, of what your ethic should have in it. And that's a good thing, because you do know what should be in it, and that's the arrow coming in from this side. And this is the functional imperative. This is where leaders of military professions have to stand up and tell the public and the public's elected representatives, as you have in the past, we cannot have obese people. You lose wars with obese people. We cannot have colorblind people. You jump out of a plane at the wrong time. I mean, there's any number of if you can't tell green from red, you're indeed Keynesian. Unless, as I told you, someone's standing there with a 9mm, doesn't make any difference what the light is. But I really want to encourage you folks, you're stewards of the profession. This is your business. If you don't do it, it will not be done, and your ethic will trend. We don't want a trending ethic. We want a changing, well-informed ethic. Majors can't do that. Lieutenant colonels can't do that. Colonels and generals can do that. This is the art of stewardship at the higher level of the profession. So I just want to encourage you, don't be daunted by a changing ethic. Get in there and make it change the right direction. And that's what I would give as in answer to Dr. Smith's question. What's the state of the ethic? Right now, it's not well attended to by the uniformed senior stewards of our profession. And if you don't tend to it, somebody else will.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder. This is a question that relates to our discussion is trending, to use your word. And anybody can respond to this because it isn't directed. This is from the audience. Since natural law is based on reason and can be approached from both secular and religious foundations, should the Department of Defense or the Army teach natural law as the foundation for morals, values, and moral leadership?
Well, I think maybe they could, especially if they approach it from the perspective of Dr. Smith. Because again, approaching it by saying, more from kind of a bottom-up perspective, like, well, what's good? What's common sense? What do we see are actually destructive behaviors? What do we see are healthy behaviors? And talking through things that way, I think it would be much more challenging to try to teach a natural law ethic on some kind of philosophical basis when we've seen how challenging it is to get any kind of agreement on what sort of the philosophical foundation might be.
That's helpful, I think, because if you do it from the bottom up, and to use Dr. Snyder's description, if that's bottom up from within the profession, what are the functional imperatives? What must the military do to do its job and achieve its ends? And now then we look at the social imperative. What are the values we must respect in order to do that? It seems to me we have a synthesis here and a way ahead for natural law. Any other?
I wonder though, let me just sort of pose a response to that, or as I'm thinking out loud here. I mean, to take the don't ask, don't tell sort of scenario. I mean, what if just maybe I'm trying to land here, but what if the military had said, you know, this isn't going to be healthy for us to fight wars in this way, to have kinds of questions of gender or sexual orientation that are kind of going on here. And, you know, so then you have the military sort of presenting, but let's say they're trying to lead in this way, as Dr. Snyder is talking about. They're trying to say this is what's going to be effective for leading the military to being successful in fighting wars. But then you do end up with the social pressures, right? That say, well, no, we need to fully integrate, not from the military necessarily, but from society, saying, no, we need to integrate the gender dysphoric or the transgender. We need to integrate those with same-sex attraction or who are acting out on same-sex attraction. And we disagree with your ethic. I mean, what do you do then? I mean, in other words, if you try to present a kind of an ethic that really is just facing social and political pressure.
I want to say a little something. Are you done? I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt.
Yeah, that's basically the question.
I think a couple ways to go. As I do think natural law can be a good basis for teaching ethics to anybody. As you say, especially on the common sense foundation. But part of it, I just had one slide where I talked about the kind of metrics. And as I said, there's just overwhelming evidence, again, that certain things are bad. You know, those who cohabit before marriage have a much higher divorce rate. As I said, those who belong to a religion and practice a religion have a much longer lasting marriage. These are scientific studies in our culture, and held in very high regard in our culture. So I would use as much of that as I possibly could, because I mean, there's a belief of natural law people, again, that bad acts have bad consequences, and we can be sure that if something is bad, we can find that it has bad consequences. Now, even things like the transgender question, there is absolutely no scientific evidence that, partly because it's a relatively new phenomenon, but there's no scientific evidence that there's any benefit to helping a 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, up to whatever age to go transgender. There's no evidence. You can't point to anything that says that this is an improvement in people's lives, they live longer, they're better off, nothing. Doctors have told me that, you know, in another 10, 15 years, there are going to be massive lawsuits against physicians who have participated in this because they're not acting on evidence-based science. So it seems to me that the military and anybody has that as something they can follow. We only do things here or allow things here that have science-based evidence that promotes them. We're not going to go with just the whims of the culture. And if it turns out that, you know, I don't believe it ever could, but if it turns out that this is all turns out to be good, everybody's happy after they do this, then you rethink it. But there's just no way in my mind it can go in that direction. And then, of course, you always have, you know, the terms I've heard, military readiness. You know, you have to ask how, you have to do the hard studies. You have to do the studies like whether it's women in combat or anything. How has this helped our military readiness? The purpose of the military, I mean, I know there's the necessity to have it be responsive to the values of a culture, etc. But we want soldiers who can win, and we want soldiers who don't have to die because of our accepting politically correct statements. We want our soldiers to live, and we want our country to be safe. And so that always has to be the standard. And so if you say, well, if we allow, you know, we have to reduce our standards for physical fitness because we're letting in a certain element of the population, they say, why did we have those standards in the first place? We had them for military readiness. And we have to have the courage, I mean, not only the courage to go fight the enemy, you have to have this courage to stand up for the principles of your own profession. And if the principles of the profession of the military are to win battles and protect the lives of our soldiers, then I want to say that the public has to bow to that. And if we don't, why would you make the sacrifice that you make for the country? So I want people to be more honest about what's the scientific evidence, whatever is being pushed, what's the which includes sociology and psychology, and what are the principles of the profession? And are those being honored, or are we pulling back on our own principles in order to satisfy a constituency that doesn't understand what we're up to? I'm on the outside, so it's easy to preach to the inside.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. You made that argument against the larger needs of the profession in a global sense. And here I've got a question for you from one of the 3x5 cards that came in. If I am a girl or a female soldier who is unhappy being female and wishes to transition, how do you discuss that choice using natural law?
Oh, again, you know, all right, what is this desire to become the other sex? Where does it come from? I've given talks on this to people, and I have to say there's like a world of difference between talking to people and talking to this person, and you always have to be clear on that. The kinds of arguments you would make to people, and which people? Believing people, secular people, what people? Parents of kids who are suffering this, what people? And then the person right there. But I gave one at a Catholic church recently, and I gave one to high school teachers in Catholic schools recently on transgenderism. And certainly within natural law, you can't turn into the opposite sex. It's absolutely a factual, literal impossibility. Every cell of your body is already sexed. You can't change that, right? You have to do something really radical to even have the physical apparatus that even resembles in some way the physical apparatus of the opposite sex. You have to override all your own natural hormones with other hormones, all right? And that is necessarily scientifically going to play havoc with your body. For a female to put in her body male hormones and vice versa, science knows that plays havoc. You're not treating any disease, you're actually creating a disease. Now, some of you might know of the phenomena of, what is it? Oh, I can't remember the word, aptomophilia or something like that. It's people who have 4 healthy limbs and they don't want 4 healthy limbs. They want to have one of their limbs amputated. Right? There was an article written about this in 2000 in the Atlantic. I read it then, it stunned me. I never heard of such a thing. But these people have 2 healthy arms and 2 healthy legs, and they see themselves as paraplegic in some way. So they will do anything. They will put their legs on railroad tracks, etc. They'll take chainsaws to cut off one of their limbs. And of course, you don't want to do that unsafely, so why shouldn't a surgeon do that for them, right? So they go into doctors and they say, I'd like my right arm or left arm removed. And so then
Biblical principles as primitive obstructions to what they call progress. That is the struggle. And it's not a struggle between dangerous religious extremism and benign secularism, not at all. If anything, the reverse. It's a struggle between what is essentially 2 competing belief systems. What distinguishes a belief system from a tennis club? In what way does a religion differ from a bowling league? Well, a religion needs to answer the 3 existential questions in life. Where did we come from? Where are we ending up? And what are we supposed to be doing in between? And so, as far as where we come from, I will give you my answer, and my co-panelists, along with all of you, may well argue with me a wording here or wording there. But I am absolutely confident that within 5 minutes of wordsmithing, we could come up with an answer to question number one with which we all agree. I would answer question number one by saying the way we got here, and it's a really good question, because at the moment it would appear that our kind exists nowhere else in the universe as far as we know so far. The arguments for the presence of life elsewhere are based on statistics which have no application here because we have no comparable model from which to draw baseline. So the answer to the question of where we came from, which I think we could play around with and quickly arrive at a consensus, is that the good Lord created us in his image and put us here. That is one religion's viewpoint of how we got here. The other side, also a religion, answers this question a little differently. They say by a lengthy process of unaided materialistic evolution, primitive protoplasm turned into nuclear scientists and Mother Teresa. That's what they say. And one shouldn't laugh at that because it's rude to laugh at other people's religions. But that is a religious belief. Where we're going to end up, again, I'm sure we'd have to play around with the wording a little bit, but we'd end up with some idea that somehow or another, on some great day of God's choosing, there is going to be some kind of death to life deliverance and some kind of eternal redemption. And you know, you'll all help me with the words, but it won't take us long. We'll end up with something with which we all agree is where we're ending up. What does the other side say? The other side says we're going to end up with doom and destruction. If it isn't nuclear winter, it'll be global warming. If it isn't that we'll all be destroyed by oceans rising, we'll all be drowned by a rising tide of disposable diapers. But whatever it is, we are absolutely doomed. That is the other side of where it's all going to end up. What are we supposed to be doing in between having got here and leaving? Again, our side is clear. What, bringing God's kingdom to the world, something like that. And again, we'll play with the wording, but essentially following ancient Jewish wisdom, improving the world, imparting the approach that makes for happier and successful living, call it natural law, but those are the things we should be doing. How about the other religion? The other religion says very clearly, very simple. The other religion says you have to be doing anything you can do to stave off the calamity that was the answer to question 2. And if it's too big for you to do yourself, you must invoke not the great G of God with which we have no truck, but the little g of government, which is every bit as important, if not more important. We'll use government to fix the problem. How about if it's even too big for government? No problem. We'll get together an association of governments. All governments together, we'll turn it into a global fight. And we'll fix this problem with all human beings with no borders and no religions and no barriers. All of us together we'll solve. These are the two views. Isaac's laughter is the affirmation that we live in a world of structure. We live in a world in which there is order. We live in a world in which, just as there are physical rules about how to build bridges or grow tomatoes, we also live in a world in which there are spiritual rules for long-term successful living. And those rules are really important, because if we rely only upon our own observational powers, well, what do you do about some mistakes we human beings make, which might take a generation or 2 or maybe 3 to fully manifest themselves, and we say, how could they have been so stupid 3 generations ago to have done this? Well, this happens all the time. We're constantly mocking the beliefs of earlier generations, and we need to dispel the arrogance that stops us realizing that future generations will mock some of our unbelievably stupid decisions. So Isaac, by virtue of laughter, and you can only laugh when there is something solid at which you're laughing, there has to be something you push against for humor to exist. If there are no eternal values, if there is no system of rules, there can be no humor. It doesn't exist. So Isaac's basically his existence and his laughter is, yes, there is a God and there is a system of rules in the universe. Along comes Jacob, his son, and indeed grapples with God. I've noticed that when I speak to various groups, particularly secular groups, and I speak about the beginning of life on the planet, and I say, there is no scientific way to determine how life began on this planet. It just isn't. There are probabilities, but there is no way to determine it. It doesn't fall into the area of science. You can't. I cannot prove to you that God created us in his image here, and you can't prove to me that he didn't. This is in the area of belief, and our lives are enormously impacted by the things we believe. And so Jacob comes along and says, look, you have to struggle with God. When I speak about the beginnings of life as being God's origin, people go nuts. They get really angry at me. And I like pointing out that if I were to talk about the flat earth, that really the earth isn't round but flat, nobody would argue with me, nobody would get angry with me, because life's too short to argue with idiots. And so anybody who believes that the earth is flat, let him go. The very fact that I drive them crazy when I say that as a person with an engineering background, my conviction is that God created the earth, they get furious about that. That's called fighting with God. The very fact that you're fighting with God is evidence that he's not a figment of your imagination. If he was, you'd be calm and you'd go and have a hot dog. That's all. No, it drives people to distraction precisely because they realize that his presence is an obstacle to everything they believe, everything they want to believe, and everything they want to do. So in that sense, Isaac establishing the obvious inevitability of a God-sculpted universe gives birth to Jacob, who obviously is the person who confronts that reality and grapples with it. We all grapple with that reality. There's not a single one of us that doesn't want to do things that deep in our heart we know we absolutely should not do. So that would be one take on the linkage, which I realize is probably exactly where you were headed when I interrupted you.
No, I think it was a beautiful embellishment, and I think we're in complete agreement. Thank you. Okay, the next question I have here, Dr. Snyder, you asked us to consider how command leadership views chaplains, and what has been your experience, and how have you seen that change over the years? Do we have the trust we need? What difference does it make that we are in an amoral society, move forward in an amoral society? So there's a couple of questions commenting on trust between the commander and the chaplain, and then, so where are we heading in that trust department? And then also in light of the moral trajectory of what this card says, an amoral society.
Well, I think I probably know which one of my friends in the audience wrote the question. That said, commander to chaplain trust. I can't think of anything in my 25 years of working with a chaplain's corps, and then before that, many years of having chaplains in my units, particularly in combat. I can't think of anything that is more important to your effectiveness, because you don't command anything. I mean, you don't. You command your unit ministry teams, but fundamentally, you're an advisory staff, and you're not responsible for the moral health of the command. The commander is. And your great challenge is that most of them, because of what we have been discussing, the younger ones are so ill-informed on moral development and moral understandings of organizations that it's intimidating to them. Most commanders in the Army today would prefer to go talk to their JAG and say, tell me about the law. Am I over the line? How close? Where am I? They do not want to go to their chaplains and say, tell me about the moral connotation of this, and where are we, and how do I determine the morally commendable thing to do and convince my chain of command that this is the right thing to do. So you're in this competition for commander's attention. And my judgment, my view, my observation, however limited it is, that you're not going as well as your legal brother. Now there's reasons for that. And the big reason is we've been fighting proxy wars for a long time. We have been fighting the kinds of wars that a chaplain's advice would be as interesting to a commander as a legal officer's advice. So commanders have tilted. So one of your challenges, to me, I'll state it as plainly as I can, as a corps, one of your challenges is assessing the state of trust between battalion and brigade commanders and your corps. What is the state of it? How do you know what the state of it is? Is it trending this way? Is it improving? Is it decreasing? And what are the major factors influencing it? And if I were, as a researcher, if I were designing a research agenda for your branch, that would be very close to the top. And let me just give you the second part of it. The second would be research designed on how you understand and deal with the inherent complexity of your corps. I don't know of any other branch in the Army that comes close to the complexity you have because of the way your people are assessed and come in with clusters of beliefs, which, yes, we could probably sit down and write a document and do some wordsmithing and agree with a lot of it, but there are some things you flat do not agree on, period, because of the denominational callings to you. So that is an inherent complexity that I don't see anywhere else in the Army. And stating it plainly, what's the issue with that? It's a trust issue. Is your corps a high trust corps? How can you make it a more high trust corps? And internally, as you make your corps more high trust, then how can you take that to your relationships to commanders and make those relationships more high trust? Now, I'm not here to prescribe solutions. As a researcher, I'd love to mark out the agenda and say, this is what you need to look at. But these are all multidisciplinary studies. This is not the kind of thing that I can sit here and say, you're quintessentially human. The whole Army profession is quintessentially a human institution. War is quintessentially a human endeavor. Humans are complex. No one discipline can come in and tell you how to analyze these problems. Every book I did on the study of military professions to renew that field, I made sure I had at least 5 disciplines in every study. I needed political scientists, I needed historians, I needed behavioralists and psychologists, I needed sociologists, and in a few cases I needed anthropologists. You can't study the kinds of human interactions that you're dealing with. Given your unique advisory role in a hierarchical profession, you can't get that in one discipline. So my encouragement would, 2 areas to go research that I think are absolutely critical to your future, not just your future, to the moral conduct of our Army. I view you, I'm sorry, I don't view you as an end in yourself. And I hope you don't either. That would be a horrible identity for your corps to have. You are an ability to provide a qualitative moral fiber to our profession. That's where your identity has to reside. Not sure if that's what you asked or if that's what you wanted to hear, but that's what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you for doing it. So, and we have, as we look at ourselves as religious supporters, in the language of an old DODI, which is defunct, but it essentially carries on in culture and in other publications. Every chaplain is brought in, when he's brought into he or she is brought into the Army. It's DODI? Did I say that? Excuse me. Department of Defense Instruction. It's a high-level Department of Defense publication that sets policy. Thank you, sir. Yes, I've got that disease. Dr. Smith, I apologize, you referenced it earlier. He or she, the chaplain, is brought in to give religious support to individuals of that person's religion and to facilitate religious support for all other people. And, as Dr. Snyder has mentioned, to do more, and that is moral leadership, moral advisement, that whole capability. And the strategic rub comes when that moral support and advisement, the context of it starts to impinge on the requirements of the chaplain's religion. That's where it's at. So how do we handle counseling or advisement regarding those elements of human sexuality that our religion confirms and affirms as morally empowering, and on the other hand, actions which we believe to be morally dangerous for body and soul. So it's an open question, and Dr. Snyder, as you have said, you can't look the answer up in the book. If you could, you would confirm that you are a dyed-in-the-wool bureaucrat. But instead we have strategic education, leader development, enhancement of skills, practice for 20 years, and we make on the spot, well thought out, moral judgments, which we then test, assess, and come back and hopefully do it better again. I don't know if any of our colleagues on the panel have any comment on this. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. So much for that. But no, because you've heard some things, I've gone through the cards. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to raise based on where our dialogue is going? Please give that man a microphone. And please, no theses to start. State your name and proceed to the question. Thank you.
Dr. Snyder, Chaplain Lawrence, based on your last comment, discussion that I was having with another senior chaplain here over the last couple of days, do you see then for a commander that potentially a chaplain is the most existential threat that he or she has to his command, given the nature of religious freedom, etc., and therefore a pitfall that he or she might see the chaplain as a threat to his or her very future in the Army?
I wouldn't state it so starkly. Let's face it, officers of any branch who are professionally incompetent in that they go over the line and do not practice their art correctly, that is abhorrent anywhere you see it, whether that person is an advisor or a commander. So I wouldn't state it so starkly, but I would say that because of the current climate, there is more risk for commanders dealing with a special staff officer, dealing in such sensitive areas as you folks have to deal with. That's why your competence is of utmost importance. Yes, I think it's always less risk for the commander to turn to the JAG officer and say, tell me exactly where the line is and tell me exactly where I am and how close am I. And I'll make the risk if I'm going to go over the line, but usually that's been my perception. As I've spoken to an awful lot of different groups and a lot of different symposia. And again, I say a lot of this comes from the nature of war. The kinds of wars we're fighting now, commanders have to be somewhat more reliant on their legal officers than they were in the past. But that doesn't mean that the moral advisor to the commander, the spiritual advisor to the commander, should be diminished at all. And I think, as I told you, I think you just have an immense opportunity because commanders are going to learn in the next few years, as they are learning now, they are struggling to do mission command. I mean, I haven't heard a senior officer yet that Dave Perkins go around the Army as a 4-star and say, we can't do mission command because we haven't created cultures of trust. And he's absolutely right, and the empirics have shown him to be correct. So commanders are, I think, going to be increasingly sensitized to the issue that the moral climate of this organization, which feeds trust, both institutionally and interpersonally, They're gonna wise up. But you're right, a chaplain that goes over the line, for whatever reason, is abhorrent. That's not professional. Hopefully, your corps is as self-policing as every other corps. Those folks shouldn't be here.
Thank you.